For 20 years, Audi produced a naturally aspirated V8 that was both smooth and high revving, and made its way into not only a diverse lineup of road cars, but the hearts and minds of its enthusiasts the world over.
Here we focus on the 5 sporting models that received the aluminum-beating heart that was the 4.2-liter V8. What we know now as the 4.2 originally started off in 1988 as a 3.6 in the Audi V8 Quattro and morphed into the engine we know and love today. And yes, we know the naming of that particular model is confusing.
It is rumored that the 3.6-liter motor that was used in the V8 Quattro is in fact two 1.8-liter Volkswagen motors mated together at the crankshaft. Whether this is true or not, this marks itself as the very first time Audi produced a V8 in any of its road-going models.
In the early 90s, Audi went racing with the 3.6, with the modified engine howling at 9,300 RPM and developing over 450 horsepower. Paired with the legendary Quattro system, this led them to a roaring victory across the finish line and thus taking the championship title for several years.
In 1991, the number 4.2 that we know and love today appeared as an option in the V8 Quattro alongside the 3.6-liter motor, which quietly folded away into the pages of history. These early 4.2 engines were used in the first generation S4 Plus, S6 Plus, and A8 models until eventually it made its way under the hood of the D2 generation S8.
Which brings us to the 5 coveted Audi sport models we received in the US that featured this glorious powerhouse of an engine. To be clear, these 5 cars are not the only vehicles Audi sold here in the States with the 4.2 V8. There's also the D2 and D3 A8s, the B6 and B7 S4s, and a few Audi Q models that featured variations of this engine. We narrowed it down to these 5 as the most exciting 4.2 wielding cars Audi sold here.
The lineup of cars that we have here today all contain a 4.2 V8, but aside from that feature, these cars could not be any more different from each other. From wagons and sedans with slushbox autos to gated 6-speed supercars and everything in between. We truly have a variety of platforms surrounding this one engine.
Well, the crazy thing as you join us here is that there is plenty of difference between these cars, not just in the transmissions and not just in the body types. There's also a ton of differentiation in even the engines. We have effectively got 3 different variations of 3 different generations of the 4.2 here. But let's not get too far into that today. Let's let the cars do the talking, starting with the first of the bunch, the 2001 D2 S8. Welcome everyone to Genesis, Audi style. This is the beginning of this sequence that we're going through of the 4.2-liter V8 being in sport, quote-unquote, Audis. And this is a 2002 D2 S8, the very first that we got here in America. So what about this car then? So this version has 365 horsepower, so a little more than the S6 we're going to test later, but a lot of other things are the same. So between these 2 cars that we're kind of going to be going back to in a minute, they share an engine, a transmission, with just minor tweaks to the camshafts and the heads that make it just a little more powerful in this car, because obviously Audi's not dumb. They know that their flagship car like this has got to have more power than their plebeian wagon that people are going to buy and with a measly 340 horsepower. And you know what? It works in this car. So this car is beautiful. Just to touch on this for a minute. It is black on black with beautiful Alcantara seats and Alcantara headliner, a solar sunroof that keeps the interior fan going while you've parked it on a hot day, a beautiful sound system, and 18-inch lovely Avis style wheels is what Audi called them. And you know what? It is such a perfect executive sport package. And this was the first time Audi did this. So they took their 4.2-liter V8, which was already here in the States in the earlier versions of the D2 A8, and decided, you know what, 300 horsepower is just not quite enough when we want to create a sport variant. So, with all the additions that they did to turn it into the S6 as well, they gave it even a little bit more to give it that oomph that you'd expect. the funny thing is, this actually weighs less than the C5 S6, which I used to own in daily drive, and is also coming next in this review. But, you know what, with that extra power, it makes a big difference. And, you know, I think that this is kind of where most of this turning the V8 engine into a sports type vehicle came from. Originally, you know, Audi created this engine back in the Audi V8 Quattro days as a 3.6 liter, then enlarged it to a 4.2, and it was originally created to be kind of a luxury car experience. So it was smooth, but it didn't produce much power. It was pretty lethargic. It was meant to just trundle you along. They decided they needed something special. Audi at this time, you know, was at the tail end of them really, really hurting for money because of all the stuff that happened with unintended acceleration in the 80s, where they had some false claims that basically their cars were unsafe and could throttle at any time and kind of kill you, which turned out to be this massive scandal. Well, it hurt the company. For 12 years, they were losing money. This chassis is what saved them. Paired with this engine, I also think this engine was a big help in helping them save them, because now it's not just this little puppy dog kind of playing around. This is a bulldog. It's like this actually moves extremely well. It's very nimble. It doesn't take long to rev up. It's actually funny. You can tell the difference in the cams and the heads just by putting your foot down. And I think doing all these changes, getting to the point where they finally built this new chassis between this and the C5, and really trying to kind of force their way forward with this new platform, with a newer variant of this engine and a completely different body design than they'd had for almost 15 years. And so when you think about like what Audi was trying to concoct here, they're trying to concoct, you know, a mission for them to succeed financially and to actually continue to make a name for themselves and make this wonderful cocktail of, you know, a massive all-wheel drive car that actually has some form of performance, which up until that time, really nobody was doing. If you wanted a BMW with all-wheel drive, you could get it, but it wasn't in any of their sports models. They were all rear-wheel drive. Same with Mercedes. All-wheel drive really didn't start existing in sports models until around this time. And I think Audi had a huge influence on that, and that's what started to sell the brand. And I think there's a lot to be said about that. We're going to talk all through this film about how charismatic and lovely and, you know, good noises that this engine makes. How all these factors kind of play into why this engine was special, despite the fact it not being loved by tuners for lack of tunability. But sometimes this is an unsung hero, I think. When this did so much for the brand and stapled them in the timestamp of history as a car company that was serious, whereas before they were just a subsidiary of the Volkswagen